Hey, how's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. So, this episode, sorry it's been a while, but we're going to finally be able to now get into some of the specifics about these different groups denying supernatural revelation. Before we looked at naturalism in general, now particularly we're going to be looking into two different groups, and there's a reason that Garrigou in particular is going to pick these two groups. And the two groups are pantheists and agnostics. So, what's so special about pantheists and agnostics? Well, basically, pantheism and agnosticism they form the, I guess they form two aspects. Any aspects of those who deny the possibility of divine revelation. Why is that? Well, it's because pantheism denies it uh, on the part of the object, so the part of the thing being revealed, and agnosticism denies it on the part of the subject, denies it on the part of us, says we can't know revelation. So pantheism says there can't be revelation. Agnosticism says we cannot know revelation, and therefore there'd be no revelation either in either sense. But they're denying it from different aspects. So any critique of the possibility of revelation is either going to be on the part of the thing being revealed or on the part of the one to whom the revelation is given or on the part of the one revealing. So that's why these two are picked. And pantheism is happens to be the one that we are going to cover first. So first we're going to kind of look into what pantheism is in general, and then we're going to look at the two different types, which is going to be empiricist or materialistic evolutionism, and then idealistic evolutionism. So those are the two that we're going to be looking into. And this is really just going to be more explanatory. Next week is going to be where we actually, go into refuting it. And this may all sound boring or whatever, having to explain all of these obscure philosophies, but trust me, it's worth it because we're going to be explaining very important things. We're going to be explaining the first principles of reason, how we arrive at them, how various systems deny the first principles of reason, which is going to help us in defeating agnosticism. It's really just going to be helpful and actually gives us kind of a concrete example to latch on to. So what is pantheistic evolutionism? Well, in the first instance, I actually, funnily enough, there was this very strange conversation on Twitter with a not so smart trad individual, and they were looking at the schema of the First Vatican Council, and they said, "Look, evolutionism is rejected in Vatican One. Therefore, those who hold to evolution in the sort of theistic evolution sense, which I don't really hold to that. But anyways, I think it's a stupid argument. Is the reason I was bringing it up. He said anybody who holds to this theistic evolution, they're actually condemned by Vatican One. And this is pretty new levels of stupidity because historically, what is this evolutionism that they're rejecting? Well, they're rejecting this idea of pantheistic evolutionism. So if you know your Greek, pan, that just means kind of like everything or all, and then theism is going to be somehow referring to God. So basically, pantheism just means that God is everything. And then when we attach this evolutionism business on there, pantheistic evolutionism just means that God becomes, or is there's everything, or there's this state of becoming of some sort, and it kind of falls into two different um, versions, broadly speaking, and they're really the same thing. It's just difference of explanation. The first is going to be that God becomes creation. So there's this kind of like this emanation of God into creation. That's basically this emanationism. That's the pantheistic evolutionism of the Neoplatonists. And then there's also kind of a different version where we could think of um, this sort of becoming by way of a sort of God becoming all of the genera and species, God basically being being, And rather than this emanation of God from himself, there's kind of like this division of God into all things. So therefore, I and you are the same thing. Me and this microphone are the same thing. So God becoming something else. And then that second form is Schelling's pantheism. And then the third form that we can think of, and this is Hegel's pantheism, is basically that creation becomes God. This may sound weird, but this is really what a lot of the modernists are running off of. So this is the important one to remember, is basically creation has some sort of perfecting of itself. Creation grows up, and in this growing up, it grows up into God. So these are the forms of pantheism that actually the First Vatican Council end up condemning. So from this doctrine of pantheistic evolutionism, we're going to have three big denials against Catholic theology when it comes to our doctrine of God. So first, well, at least as it relates to De Revelatione. So first, there's going to be the denial of the existence of the true God, the Creator. So they're going to have to deny that God is a creator because there's no intervention of a creative cause. Rather, there's basically this becoming. A creation is different than a becoming, because basically when it comes to a creation, there is the formation of an entirely new subject outside of the creator. But with this becoming, and this is called pantheistic immanentism, with this pantheistic immanentism, the subject morphs. So there's really more like a transformation than a creation that occurs. And then second, it follows from this that there's a denial of the existence of the supernatural order. Now, why would this follow? We think about it, when we talk about the supernatural order, what we mean by the supernatural orders, we mean some sort of formal participation in the divine nature. But basically, when you're a pantheistic evolutionist, everything is formally participating in the divine nature. So that rock over there, since it is formally participating in the divine nature, that rock is going to have this sort of this rock is going to be a supernatural rock. And then third, obviously what's going to follow is there's going to be denial of the possibility of miracles. Well, why does that follow? Well, because of this, because of their doctrine, they think that the becoming of God, this transformation, is going to be what's happening when change is happening. So there's not going to be this ability for this free intervention of God working above the order of nature, because God himself is identified with the order of nature, which ends up being a formal participation of God, and then basically denying supernature. So you can see how so many messes against what we've set out is already coming to be, no pun intended, from this pantheistic evolutionism. And from this, we're going to have a very interesting. How do I put it? We're gonna have a very interesting doctrine of the explanation of religious phenomena. Because what they're going to hold is they're going to hold that religious phenomena, the various doctrines and dogmas of various religions, is really God growing up within us. And this is why Hegel's position, which I mentioned, Hegel becomes so important for the modernists, because the modernists are basically pantheistic evolutionists. So they think that truth is kind of growing up with us, because it really is identified with us. So the Catholic Church isn't divinely instituted. Rather, all of our feelings, all of our sentiments about it are what are divinely instituted. And finally, there's an interesting comment that Garrigou makes at the end of the first section of this chapter about what he calls moderate evolutionism, which we would just think of as evolution. He says, so defined, absolute evolutionism essentially differs from moderate evolutionism, which admits at least that God the Creator intervened in the world to produce matter, vegetative life, sense life, the intellective soul, and the infusion of grace. Moderate evolutionism only holds that the species of plants or animals which now exist are not ontological species with indivisible and immutable specific differences, but are only empirical classes under which there are certain true yet few species of living things, from which they arise through successive transformations, somehow like the various kinds of dogs come from the dog species. The moderate form of evolutionism has not been condemned by the Church. However, this treatise is not the place to discuss it. So that's a very interesting comment from Garrigue, and kind of unexpected, at least I think for a lot of people. So the first type of evolutionism that we are going to discuss, as I mentioned, there's materialistic or empiricist, and then there's idealistic. So the first one is going to be the materialistic evolutionism, and it's also called monism. And this was held by some of the ancients like Empedocles. But basically, this thinks that the principle of all things is going to be matter itself. And this matter itself, these sort of physiochemical phenomena, uh, basically, the matter itself becomes other things. A lot of people today are going to hold to this sort of materialistic evolutionism. So, what this system's going to say is it's going to say that the highest form of this evolution of matter is going to be in reason. And that's that's basically going to be their whole system. Is there's going to be a certain superiority of reason that happens because reason is the highest form of the evolution of matter, which is why it's also called empiricist evolutionism. But we are more concerned with the religious aspects to this form of evolutionism. Basically, there's going to be a denial of the supernatural order of truth, and this should be obvious from the exaltation it has of the reason as the highest form of evolutionism. And it's also going to deny the possibility of miracles because it kind of thinks that God is immanent, therefore locked in materially. So the first cause isn't going to be able to work over the material order, but that's not the sort of important thing. The important thing is the positive aspects that it's going to, and by positive I mean the things it posits. Not that these are good things; these are horrible things. But it basically thinks that religion and religious phenomena in general, they tend to be some sort of weird. Perennialist types, but they think that all of these religious phenomena are basically demands from man's religious sentiment. They're fulfilling all of the exigencies of the heart. That's what religion is doing. So while science is going to fulfill all the needs of the reason, science has not found a way how to fulfill the needs of the heart, and therefore we need religion for now. Eventually, once we get rid of it, but for now, we need religion in order to fulfill these needs of the heart, because science can't do it yet. Although one day science is gonna, in the lab invent and write a journal article or meta analysis or whatever stupid thing about how we can have a positivistic religion. So when it looks at Christianity, it's going to distinguish various things. So they really distinguish between the true, the beautiful, and the good. When it comes to the true, it's going to say that Christianity, there's nothing worth anything in it. They're going to say they might interpret, all of these truths that we put forward in a sort of symbolic sense, but it's going to say dogmas are bad. We're bad for dogmas. And then also when it looks at the beautiful, it's going to say that, well, we kind of just we're being inconsistent by having beautiful things. We kind of just stole from the pagans anyways, and therefore, technically, yeah, it exists in us, but it exists in us as something outside of us. But the real thing that it wants to take from us, it wants to take the good from us. And the reason it wants to take the good from us is because it doesn't understand at all. It's like a meme version of what Christianity is. It sees that it holds that Christianity has this sort of tolerance and compassion and charity. It interprets these in the worst possible sense, and it says, well, it's good for keeping the the dummies for now acting well. We don't know about this mortification stuff. We don't know about this this sort of rigidity that Christianity has, but it's good for keeping the dummies from acting up. But eventually we'll have positivist religion, which will be able to teach us how to act well without having all of these silly superstitious dogmas. That's basically what they hold to. So practically speaking, they're going to order three things. First, they're going to order the separation of church from state, so the state can develop her good positivist religion while the church goes into oblivion. Second, there needs to be this lay education of religious things, but it needs to be something which is, um, you know, not in the confines of dogma. And then third, there needs to be, and this is the biggest thing, there needs to be a course in the history of religions. The history of religions. I actually, if any of you have ever listened to R.C. Sproul, I used to listen to him a lot. He's a Protestant, but I know a lot of people who used to be Protestant listen to him. He actually had he has a sort of bit that he would frequently give where he went to a university, and they asked him like how they can, you know, do a little bit now that they have a more conservative staff and such, how they can do a little bit of reformation of some of the errors that they had brought about. And he asked them what their department that studies Christianity, what's it called? And he said, "Oh, you mean our religious studies department?" And he said, "Well, that's the first problem you need to fix." So what's the problem there? Religious studies versus something like theology. Well, what's the problem between those two different names? Well, it actually signifies something completely different. Theology signifies that it's the study of God. It's the study of truth. That's what we're studying. We're studying revelation, working from the principles of faith. We can achieve truth. But when we study religions, what are we studying? We study religions, we're rather studying a sort of social phenomenon. We're studying the way in which the idea of God has affected various people. So the whole idea of religious studies, the whole genesis of religious studies, the whole purpose of religious studies is to somehow say that Christianity is not unique in any way. That's the purpose of religious studies. That's the purpose of this history of religions, is to just show how silly that we actually are. And what you'll see from these people, it's very interesting. Garrigou says that they're disseminated by Masons, big if true. But what they're gonna do is they're gonna have this great sort of praise of Christianity, and they'll have this praise for our Lord. They'll say he's great, but in a very particular way. And you'll see it's going to be the areas that they like, and they're eventually going to be inconsistent, and it becomes a praising of the meme version of Christianity. So like a sort of Reddit, oh, why don't the Christians act like Jesus, sort of thing. That existed back in the early 20th century, but that's basically what goes on with these empiricist evolutionists. So now that we've covered what this materialistic evolutionism is, or I can pronounce words, evolutionism is, now we're going on to the second type. So this is going to be a little bit more lengthy because there's going to be a lot of historical analysis rather than strictly doctrinal. So this second type, and this is the more common type, at least in his day, and more dangerous type, and the type that we need to watch out for. That's idealistic evolutionism. So, and these are easy to remember because materialistic, what does it flow from? Matter. So what does idealistic evolutionism flow from? Ideas, well, kind of. An ideal principle. So there's some sort of ideal principle, extra material principle, from which all of this stuff, they call it the absolute, all of this stuff is going to flow forth from. And of course, it flows forth in a lesser way in that rock over there. But for them, it's going to flow forth into human reason. And the human reason is going to be the loftiest form of this whole evolution. This whole evolution finds its peak in human reason, because that's when the absolute is going to become self-conscious. And therefore, this absolute self-consciousness, purified by reason, is going to be able to judge everything. So philosophical reason ends up being the big judge of all things. So there's going to be 5 forms in which we're going to look at. The first form is going to be how this all kind of finds its origin in ancient Gnosticism. Then we're going to look at Spinoza who his pantheism is going to pave the way for Fitch, and then a Schelling, and then finally it's going to find its important form in Hegelianism. And in Hegelianism is where we're going to, camp out there for a bit and describe their doctrine in particular. So the first form that I said that we were going to mention is that of Gnosticism. And this may sound like a weird place to start, and it kind of is, but it provides a lot of the background for what we're going to later see in Spinoza and a lot of the Neoplatonists in the 15th century. So Gnosticism basically has this idea that God cannot act immediately in the world. So there's going to have to be some sort of denial right there already of supernatural revelation and of miracles. So what they thought is there's basically this these sort of mediating spirits, and they're called aeons, ages in English, iones, if you want the Greek, but like aeons is what they're called. I one time read Saint Irenaeus is against heresies, and I had to read about all this. It was terrible. But basically, this is kind of just a mixture between some sort of Neoplatonic emanationism and then also some sort of dualism, because what you have on the one hand is there's all of these aeons through which God creates. Like, yeah, they're kind of like mediating influences, but they're really sort of emanations that come from God. And then the world emanates from these aeons. So everything out there are going to be emanations of emanations. And therefore, you're going to have this pantheism that's going to form from this. And this isn't a free creation. This is something which is necessary, a sort of necessary emanation, which comes from God. And then one of these, according to the Gnostics, one of these spirits, the demiurge decided to create matter, and matter was bad. And the human spirits, they have this formal participation in God, which is why it's a denial of the supernatural order. But they already have this formal participation in God, and they get dragged down in matter. So there's this sort of dualism that has matter evil, spirit good. And the whole purpose of life is to become untrapped from this matter. Now, this is technically this offers the background for this idealistic evolutionism, but there's a few differences. So the first difference is going to be the fact that with as I kind of mentioned in the beginning, there's this sort of descending evolutionism that happens, where it's God to aeons to creatures. This descending that happens, this emanation that happens. Where with others, there's a sort of ascending, where it starts from the bottom and then goes up and becomes God. So in the emanationism, God becomes creation. In the other forms, creation becomes God. So that's the first difference. Then the second one is there isn't this sort of immanentism. There isn't an immanentism. Rather, they still hold that it's transient. So it's outside of God. So it's kind of just like God is sort of God is the sun, and there's these rays of lights of the divinity coming forth. So it would kind of be like a sort of pseudo supernaturalism sort of idea, where you have grace or formal participation in the divine nature, the supernatural order necessarily emanating from God. And it's just a denial of free creation and a denial of the natural order. But this small mistake in the beginning, this sort of confusion of creation with emanation, the confusion of the supernature with the nature, that's going to provide a lot of problematic trends, which we'll see fully flower out into the errors of Spinoza and then later philosophers. So now we're going to get into the theory of Spinoza right after the theory of the Gnostics. So when it comes to Spinoza, he's known as the prince of the modern rationalists, because he set forth a philosophy. And interestingly enough, Spinoza was a Jew. But Spinoza, as a Jew, set forth a lot of very interesting principles of revelation, a lot of very interesting principles of the interpretation of Scripture, of the interpretation of miracles in the Old Testament. He was actually excommunicated from his Jewish community for doing this. But in order to understand what he was getting at with his attacks on sacred Scripture, or at least the Old Testament, we have to first understand his theory of substance, and then his theory of knowledge, and then lastly his theory of beatitude. So when it comes to his theory of knowledge, his theory of substance, what's most important is that Spinoza understood substantial being to be completely unique. So what he means by this is that there is only one substance. There's one substance throughout the entirety of the world. So it's a form of monism. And it's also a form of pantheism because he identified this one substance as God. So Spinoza, he was an absolute realist. So when there was this concept in our intellect, when we conceive of substance, we conceive of substance as a single notion, the notion of substance, the genus of substance. We conceive of that notion. He said, therefore, there has to just be one substance. Since we consider things abstractly under the species of eternity. So therefore, from this, there must be this singular universal substance, this numerically singular universal substance, which eternally subsists. So obviously, there's going to be this this identification with this substance, with the divine substance. I mean, this kind of follows naturally because he thought that universals exist formally in reality. So if he has this universal concept of substance that's abstract and therefore something which is something which is eternal, then therefore it's going to be something which becomes the divine, the idea is the divine being. And I hope I explained that correctly because this kind of gets a little bit dicey, but he's a hyper realist. So universals formally exist really in reality. So therefore, from this idea that there is, a unique, substantial being, then therefore it's obviously going to be God. But it's important to recognize that Spinoza, he becomes a nominalist when it comes to all of the phenomena that we have. So he's basically saying there's this singular, divine being. Substance is one. Everything is this one substance, which is identical with God, and all the phenomena that come out are basically a bunch of confused notions that our intellect is going to collect together and smashing them together, try to form categories for them. So what's also important to understand is that Spinoza, he's going to apply the geometric method to philosophy. So with geometry, the one who does geometry, he's going to posit definitions and then he's going to deduce properties. So it's definition, property, definition, property, definition, property. There's going to be no consideration of final causality. There's going to be no consideration of efficient causality. It's just all basically going to be formal causality. So when Spinoza considers God, he's not going to consider God as efficient cause. He's not going to consider God as final cause. He's going to merely consider God as immanent cause. And where we see he goes wrong, not only with this methodology, but he goes wrong with the way in which he's going to define substance. So the way he defines substance, he defines it as a self-subsistent being, which is close. It gets close to the real definition. But this self-subsistent being for Spinoza has to be ase. So there has to be aseity to this self-subsistent being, which then obviously is going to be God. So from this, he's going to draw forth all of the divine attributes, and he's going to deny any sort of freedom to this ase, eternal substance that is unique in all things. So obviously, this theory of substance is going to be very problematic because this theory of substance is going to make all of us basically finite modes of the eternal substance, identical with the eternal substance. There's a sort of becoming an extension of this substance in us and through us. So obviously, there's going to be no supernatural order, because not only are we a formal participation in God naturally, but also we are we're a finite mode of God naturally. So it's like a double denial of the supernatural order, and also he's going to deny the possibilities of miracles as well. Now, after this, we can think of his theory of knowledge. His theory of knowledge is basically what we would call a form of ontologism. So, what is ontologism? There's two. Famously, it was exemplified by Malebranche and Rosmini. Um, but when it comes to Spinoza, who was in many ways a forerunner of those others, um, Spinoza thought that we have this because God is identified with this universal of substance, and because our intellects, the first thing that is the first object of our intellects is a sort of confused notion of substantial being. Therefore, he would reason from this that we see and know all things in the divine essence. That the first notion we have in our intellects is a sort of confused notion of the divine essence. So this would obviously destroy the any sort of supernatural revelation, because I mean we already have this sort of confused notion in us. It's kind of just bringing it out. When it comes to supernatural revelation, we can't hold that this is the case at all. And he kind of does the same thing when it comes to the supernatural order concerning the will. He thinks that basically our love for God is the love by which God loves himself. So from this, basically, this denial of individual acts of our soul is going to end up denying any sort of personal immortality, and immorality, actually, but any sort of personal immortality. And rather, we're just going to have a sort of impersonal immortality where we end up, being all coming together and all meshing into one, because according to him, we all are God, and all of our intellectual acts are the intellectual acts of God. And this all follows from his really weird view of his view of what substantial being is, along with his sort of weird, weird hyperrealism. Okay, now it's time for Fitch and Fitch. I think it's Fitch. German, weird German names. But anyway, Fitch, his form of evolutionism basically comes about as not really a reaction to Kantianism, but more so what he saw as a purification of Kantianism. Because whereas Spinoza talked about this natural intuition of the divine being, Kant is going to say that when it comes to the first apprehension, when it comes to these first categories of reason, there's something which are a priori subjective forms, and from these we classify phenomena. That's what Kant believed. But Fitch, he saw a difficulty with this idea of these a priori categories, which are going to go out and are going to help classify these phenomena. He says, well, where exactly do these relations come from? It seems that it's arbitrary. I mean, why would reason apply the category of causality instead of substance for these phenomena? Where do they come from? So, what Fitch said is Fitch said that basically to avoid the arbitrary application of these categories, these a priori forms in the intellect, and also to keep subjectivism, so to keep the fact that it's previously in the mind, like Kant said. Basically, he said that it must arise from the knowing subject. It must arise, this application must arise from us, not outside of us, because if there's some sort of if we say that reason sees some sort of relation to causality in these phenomena, then that's already the scholastics doctrine. If that's what we say, and some argue that that's actually what Kant was holding to by this. But he said that, well, this stuff needs to arise just from us, not from anything outside of us, because he wants to hold that the reasoning is purely autonomous, not only for these categories, these forms, but also for the very phenomena themselves. So basically, we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, how does this production of the phenomena, how does this production happen? And he says that there's this sort of unconscious, involuntary arising that happens. And he does this by distinguishing two I's or two egos, or egos, if you want to put it like that, if you want to pronounce it wrong. But I'll say ego, but two egos. So there's going to be our individual ego. That's the sort of our self-consciousness. And then on the other hand, there's this transcendent, infinite, and universal ego. So this transcendent, infinite, and universal ego, that is that ideal principle. And this ideal principle is going to be beaming in these phenomena for us, and we come up with the sort of forms. There's these two I's, one which is shared by all, and one which is not. So you have this. He says that this transcendent ego is the practical reason of human society, that wherein our individual egos are able to figure out what's going on and develop more and more to actually bring about this pure autonomous practical reason, to bring out this fullness of the freedom of humanity. And he said that the best place this is, you want to guess, the best place this is in German science and philosophy, which apparently to him dominated every sort of law and every sort of moral grounds. It beat everything. But he did this in order to keep forth everything when it came to subjectivism. Okay, and now we're finally at the last guy. So I have this chart here. So this is Schelling. And Schelling's going to be the guy before we talk about Hegel, which is Hegel's the big old important one that we want to talk about. So basically we had Spinoza up here. Spinoza had his pantheistic ontologism, his intuition of God, and Kant had his subjective agnosticism. Fichte, he wanted to keep his sort of subjectivism, but he thought that there was a inconsistency with Kant, so he came up with this sort of dual ego, which brings about the non-ego in us. And then Schelling, basically his whole thing, Schelling. It's crazy. Schelling said, well, this is stupid. He said, it's stupid because the universal ego cannot produce the non-ego. He said, the ego can't bring about the object or the phenomena into us, because basically these two are simultaneous with one another, and they're limited by one another. So he said, well, sure, there's this transcendent universal ego, and then there's this non-ego, but actually there presupposes something else. So I guess it's not really too much of a critique of Fichte. It's saying Fichte didn't go far back enough. So basically Fichte needed to go back one more step, and this was to the absolute. I know it sounds kind of cringe, actually. So what is this absolute? So this absolute, it's not object, it's not subject, it's not nature, not spirit, not reality, not idea. Rather, it's the wellspring and source of all of these things. It's the identity of all of these things in their difference in one thing. So we have this absolute. It's not transcendent. It's not distinct from the world, but rather it's in the world and manifests itself in all of these things. So if we go back through all of these various phenomena, we go back through everything, we can find the absolute. So this is basically a form of descending evolutionism. It's an immanentist that it's the God becomes the world sort of thing. God becomes the world, and obviously this is going to be a denial of the supernatural order, because he goes back to what Spinoza is saying about the intuition of God. And he says, well, it's this intuition of the absolute that we experience in these various phenomena, going from vague to distinct. So he's going to do really stupid things like proposing rationalistic interpretations of Catholic dogmas like the Trinity. So right here we come up to Hegel, which Hegel begins as this critique of Schelling's system. So as I said, Hegel comes as a critique of Schelling's system, because the issue is he said, well, if you have there's a transcendent absolute, this doesn't explain anything. How does it explain all of the opposition that constitutes the real world? How does it explain all of these opposition between, the material and the immaterial and blah, 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 blah? How does this explain a passage from primitive unity in the absolute to a multiplicity of phenomena? He doesn't think that this explains it at all, and therefore the absolute becomes a mere abstraction. So we have to say that actually Hegel's kind of right. Hegel's right that we can't deduce the world in an emanationist manner from God if God does not stand in need of any perfection. So Catholics explain this by an absolutely and utterly free act of creation, but Hegel, he didn't buy this act of free creation. He didn't think that it was intelligible. So he decided to go into a different direction. So what he strove to do is he strove to show how a multiplicity of phenomena necessarily proceeds from a kind of primitive unity, kind of like what Schelling was doing, what all of these critique after critique after critique was trying to do. So he thought the issue with Schelling was that Schelling thought that there was a transcendence to the absolute. He didn't buy this. So for the first time in history, what we had a kind of flip on its head. So basically every form of pantheism before this is a sort of emanationism. So Spinoza said God becomes the world. Schelling says God, the absolute, becomes all of these phenomena. They all say this, but what Hegel did, and this is kind of brilliant in a very evil manner, is he flipped it on its head. He said, no, actually, God doesn't become the world becomes God. The world becomes God through its evolution. So we have this immanent absolute, and this immanent absolute works out towards perfection. That was his kind of crazy idea that he came up with. So from here it only gets weirder. Trust me, guys. It only goes downhill from here. So with Hegel, in order to understand Hegel, you need to understand his love. He absolutely freaking loved contradiction. He loved contradiction. So what he would posit is what he called the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis. And that's how he explained all of this evolution. So basically for him, when we think of this universal being that the immanent absolute has, it is in one way being, because obviously it's the universal being, but in another way it's immobile, undetermined. It's in another way non-being. So between this being and non-being, between this thesis and this antithesis, we need a becoming. We need a synthesis, or the being is going to be fruitless. So contradiction leading to synthesis is fruitful for him. So the being and the non-being, it's going to need to move forward by becoming. So for him, evolution is life. Evolution needs to come on. There needs to be needs to go from this universal being to all of these modalities. So it's good for him for being to become all of the various genera and species of being. So the absolute immanently is going to come into all of these different modalities, and that's how being is going to work. for Hegel. Yeah, I know it's weird, but it is what it is. It's pretty wacky. So evolution, contradiction, becoming, these become these fundamental laws of the developmental process of the creative idea. And as it becomes more and more, as this becoming continues and continues, as the synthesis between contradiction continues and continues, it's moving towards perfection. It's moving towards, for him, this absolute is moving towards godhood. And the reason becomes a sort of highest form of this, because the reason's able to kind of follow and self-reflect on this becoming process. And now here we get into a bit of the wacky stuff. This is going to be his ideas on the philosophy of spirit and religious philosophy. This is the wacky stuff, because here you're going to see his like evolutionism just kind of go on overdrive. So first, he has this subjective spirit. So the subjective spirit, this is going to be the thesis. The subjective spirit is the appearance of like a sort of individual spiritual life in social men, knowing what's right for them. And then you have, from this comes the objective spirit. So the objective spirit is going to be this social force, basically. Social institutions, law, history, basically things like matrimony, death penalty, war. The sort of social objective spirit is basically the championship of the victor. Therefore victory becomes the voice of God here. And then obviously you're going to have, between the individual and the society, there's going to be some sort of clashing, which happens. And in this clashing, this thesis and antithesis, you have the synthesis of the absolute spirit. So the absolute spirit is basically like a sort of self-reflection on spirit itself. Which if you see this little chart, this basically this ascending form is what I'll be describing here. So as we mentioned before, you have the unconscious idea of being and the unconscious idea of non-being, which forms unconscious becoming. That's the first level that we just talked about in metaphysics. And then above this, you have this subjective spirit and the objective spirit, which forms the absolute spirit. So now in the absolute spirit line, you now get these sort of three forms of the spiritual life. The first one is found in art, and art ends up being sensual. So since it's so sensual, and in each one of these, he also has synthesis and antithesis. So yeah, it becomes a little confusing. His thesis is Eastern art, which is pantheistic, and his antithesis is Greek art, which is human, and then Christian art ends up being the synthesis of the art little section. So you see this dude loves the synthesis stuff. And then on religion is a sort of reaction. It's the antithesis of art, and this you have a certain thesis of art. There's this ascending evolution that happens in art. You have Eastern religion, which ends up being pantheistic, and Greek ends up being humanistic. And the synthesis of this religion ends up being that of Christianity. So now you have Christianity and Christian art right there, the sensual and the spiritual. And that's thesis and antithesis. And the synthesis of these two is speculative philosophy. And wouldn't you know, within this speculative philosophy, before we get into, now that we're in the philosophical realm, up there on the top level, right there. So we see this sort of ascending process of becoming, the unconscious and the conscious being kind of flowing up the line of becoming God. We see that there is this process of antithesis, thesis, and synthesis. Antithesis, thesis, and synthesis. There's this process in philosophy as well. Wouldn't you have it? First, you have Parmenides with his philosophy of being, and you have Heraclitus with his philosophy of becoming. These are set in opposition, and then you have all of these reconciliations which occur. And then you have the sophists and Socrates, and then this this synthesis is in Platonism. And then you have Plato and Aristotle, and this reconciliation is found in Plotinus. And then you have Greek philosophy and Christianity, and this synthesis is found in St. Augustine and then St. Thomas. And then you have this opposition between scholastic philosophy and modern philosophy, and this synthesis doesn't happen until a little bit later. Various syntheses are tried to produce, and then you have empiricism and spiritualism, and then this gets synthesized by Kant, and then you have Fichte and Schelling, and of course, who's the guy? Who's the guy he puts on top? Could you guess? Hegel. He puts himself on top. He says all of this, idea of becoming. So first you have the unconscious idea and the of being and non-being, which becomes becoming. And then from this, you have the subjective spirit, objective spirit becomes absolute spirit. And this is expressed in art and religion, which synthesizes in philosophy. And then you have all of these different philosophies. And they all, of course, on the top of all of the evolution of all of the being and non-being and blah, 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 antithesis, thesis, blah, 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 blah. The highest synthesis, the most godlike, obviously, is in Hegel himself. he thought he really, he thought he really kind of, put the end to everything. Okay, so now how does this exactly specifically apply to things? So since Hegel himself, Mr. Smarty Pants, has now ascended to the top rung, Hegelian philosophy now becomes the judge from on high. And as we see, religion is in the rung below on the which is synthesized in philosophy itself. So Hegelian philosophy is going to judge religion. Also, it's at a higher level of synthesis than religion. So there's obviously a denial of the supernatural order. But because philosophy becomes a synthesis from the antithesis of religion to art, because of this, Hegel actually takes a slightly different approach. And we'll see this in the modernists, and this becomes very dangerous. But Hegel, what he wants to do is he actually wants to retain Christian dogmas. But what he wants to do is he wants to understand them in a more philosophical manner. Because he says, well, contradiction, according to him, as we mentioned earlier, contradiction isn't bad. A contradiction is the sort of mother of all things. Contradiction is fruitful. So when we have these religious dogmas that have some sort of contradiction in themselves, we can preserve what is judged true by philosophy. We can interpret them in what is fruitful within them for the becoming stuff, which ends up being perfected in idealistic evolutionism. So, for example, the Trinity, we can keep the dogma of the Trinity, but it's understood as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. We can keep creation in the sense that the infinite itself alone exists, along with the finite, but we have to understand the finite to be within the infinite. We can keep the redemption, because redemption for him is going to be understood in the process of self-becoming. We can understand all of these different dogmas of the Christian faith. We can understand them as sort of lower forms of the evolution that comes into idealistic evolutionism. So we can affirm them. We just have to understand them in a slightly different sense. And that's what modernism does. That's what modernism does pretty consistently. So that's basically it. But what's important to notice, what's important to remember, is that basically when it comes to Hegelianism really isn't held as a system of thought per se, but the spirit of the system is held by many of the modernists. So as I'm sure you can imagine from the way in which I laid out this system, it could be very tricky. And that's why the modernists were so difficult to push out, because they would interpret basically everything in their own sense. Okay, so I think that is about all for this section. Next section, we will be critiquing pantheistic evolutionism. Right here was just an explanation of the history behind it. So